Picture this. It is the winter of 1916, somewhere along the Western Front. The ground beneath your boots is not earth anymore. It is a cold, sucking paste of clay, rainwater, and things you do not want to think about. The trench walls sweat moisture that never dries. The air smells of wet wool, wood smoke, decay, and something you cannot name until a medic crouches beside you, opens a worn canvas satchel, and releases into that rancid air the faint, clean ghost of a kitchen garden in summer. Lavender, yarrow, thyme. Suddenly, impossibly, you are somewhere else entirely. This is not a story about grand military strategy. This is a story about the small, stubborn acts of knowledge and love that kept men alive in the mud, and what those acts can teach us today about fieldcraft, resilience, and the ancient relationship between human beings and the plants at their feet. The apothecary in the satchel. When a young medic packed his kit before deployment, Army-issue supplies were heartbreakingly limited. Iodine, bandages, morphine tablets, and never enough of any of it. The trenches of the Somme and Passchendaele housed hundreds of thousands of men in conditions that would make a Victorian slum look hospitable. Trench foot rotted flesh from bone. Dysentery swept through dugouts like fire through dry grass. Infected wounds turned septic with terrifying speed in that bacteria-rich, waterlogged environment. So medics and soldiers alike reach back to something older than battlefield medicine, the herb lore passed down through generations of rural households. Yarrow, known botanically as Achillea millefolium, had been named for Achilles himself, who legendarily used it to staunch his soldiers' wounds at Troy. Its astringent compounds genuinely slow bleeding and carry mild antimicrobial properties that World War I medics, trained in a world still bridging folk remedy and germ theory, understood to be real and useful. Dried bundles went into satchels alongside field dressings, applied as poultices when formal antiseptics ran dry. Thyme was no mere culinary afterthought. Thymol, the compound extracted from it, was already an active ingredient in commercial antiseptic preparations of the era. Carrying dried thyme was not superstition, it was pragmatic chemistry. Shelter, scarcity, and the art of making do. The fieldcraft of World War I soldiers extended far beyond medicine. Survival in the trenches demanded a continuous, improvised ingenuity that, honestly, any modern bushcrafter would recognize and respect. Dugouts were constructed, not with timber yards and blueprints, but with whatever could be scavenged. Ammunition crates, corrugated iron sheets, sandbags filled and stacked with the precision of men who knew their lives depended on the geometry of the stack. A poorly built roof meant not just discomfort, but, well, death if a shell struck nearby and the structure collapsed inward. Water management was its own daily campaign. Rainwater collected in shell craters was dangerously contaminated, yet thirst is thirst, and men developed field filtration methods from layered cloth, charcoal scraped from cook fires, and sand. Soldiers who had grown up working the land, and in 1914 a huge proportion of enlisted men had, brought with them an intuitive understanding of terrain and drainage that no officer's manual could replicate. Camouflage, too, was a living craft. Factory-produced netting was scarce. Soldiers learned to break their silhouettes using mud on helmets, strips of hessian woven through wire, and whatever shattered landscapes surrounded them. Snipers on both sides constructed observation posts from papier-mâché tree stumps, spending hours motionless in no man's land, reading wind and light with the patience of hunters, because that is precisely what they were. Return now to those dried herbs, because they did something no field manual could quantify. When a soldier crushed a sprig of lavender between his fingers in the dark of a dugout, breathing in the scent of his wife's garden, the sun-warm path beside the back door, Saturday afternoons before the world broke, that act was medicine too. Military medical authorities of the era were beginning to understand, in the rudimentary language of 1916 psychology, that morale was not a luxury. A man convinced he was going to die stopped taking the careful, disciplined precautions that kept him alive. A man who still had something to live for, even something as fragile as the memory of a herb garden, fought harder against both the enemy and the infections working through his blood. The women who packed those herbs understood this, without needing clinical language for it. They were practicing a form of fieldcraft as ancient and sophisticated as anything taught in a survival school today. The knowledge that preparation for hardship is not only physical, it is emotional, it is sensory, it is the deliberate preservation of connection to what matters. More than a century separates us from those waterlogged trenches, and yet the lessons they contain are startlingly current. Every modern bushcrafter who reaches for a yarrow tincture, every survivalist who understands that morale is a tactical resource, every outdoors person who has learned to read terrain and improvise shelter, they are all heirs to what those men learned under impossible conditions. The soldiers and medics of the First World War had no modern gear, no purification tablets, no satellite communicators. They had observation, adaptation, inherited plant knowledge, and an absolute refusal to surrender to circumstances. That is the fieldcraft that endures. The herb gardens are still there, in a sense. In every forested hillside where yarrow grows white and feathery along the trail edge, in every kitchen window-sill where time sits in a pot, in the knowledge stubbornly alive across generations that the prepared mind is the most powerful survival instrument ever created. Those men in the mud did not just survive a war, they left a manual. We just have to be willing to read it. If this episode gave you something to think about, something to learn, or something to feel, this is exactly what Fieldcraft Chronicles exist to do. We are building a library of forgotten knowledge, wartime wisdom, and practical fieldcraft for everyone who believes that history is not just the past, but a living manual for the future. Subscribe to Fieldcraft Chronicles so you never miss an episode, and share this video with every history lover, prepper, and bushcraft learner in your life. The knowledge that kept men alive in the worst conditions humanity has ever produced is too important to lose. Help us make sure it isn't.